Our next panel, if OpenStack is so awesome, why doesn't everybody use it? Chris Kemp.
Thanks, guys. Thanks. And it's not just me. Actually, we've got a bunch of distinguished analysts that we've put together to talk about this today. And what's exciting about this group is we have some folks that worked at Gartner, at GigaOM, 451 group that are now at Red Hat respectively, Google respectively, and at 451. So I'm going to quickly introduce Peter Fuchs on the left. He's done a lot of fantastic research on OpenStack, focusing on customer adoption over the past year or so. So we're going to hear from him today. Joe Maitland was at GigaOM for a couple of years, is now at Google, thinking about Google Cloud and adoption and how to break into the enterprise. And Alessandro Pirelli was at Gartner, where he spent a lot of time running their OpenStack research practice and is now at Red Hat. So we have a private cloud infrastructure platform analyst perspective, a public cloud perspective, and then a pure analyst perspective here. So I want to kick it off by asking this question, and I'll start with Peter. Over the past week or two, we've seen huge tectonic shifts in OpenStack. We've seen folks like Martin Mikos join HP. We've seen the former CTO of Red Hat join Google. We've seen one of the former entrepreneurs here in the Bay Area that was responsible for both the CIA and the NSA adopting Amazon and OpenStack respectively go to Amazon Web Services, where he's a VP of engineering, Bill Voss. So what does this mean? And are we seeing a big shift here?
Okay, so what does it mean? Firstly, enterprises tend to move relatively slowly, but certainly everything that we're saying says the future of IT is cloud-based in some form or other. Private cloud, public cloud, hybrid cloud, some kind of mixture. Secondly, enterprises typically don't like to get locked into any particular vendor. And so although VMware has had an early lead with its sort of proprietary cloud technologies, and definitely has got a big enterprise presence and is getting wide adoption, OpenStack is coming up very closely behind, whether one looks at OpenStack as a generic thing for the future or the various different implementations from IBM, from HP, from Red Hat, from all the other vendors, getting very close. What that also means is there's going to be big, big money in cloud, because if most things IT are going to be cloud-based, that's an awful lot of money. And therefore, there's going to be a lot of positioning between the vendors. And if OpenStack is the sort of second contender, maybe trailing VMware a little bit right now, but accelerating very fast, essentially, there will be blood. There will be mergers, there will be acquisitions, there will be alliances formed. And this is, though, very good for OpenStack because it's really putting a huge amount of energy and consolidation behind the platform.
Thanks. Joe?
Yeah, no, I think the trends you point to are definitely salient in terms of what's happening in the industry right now. They're core personnel hires, right? Brian Stevens brings incredible open source capabilities to Google, and Martin, has 5+ years leading as a evangelist in the cloud market, and then decades behind him in open source. So these are like core personnel hires that will make a difference at these companies.
I agree with Joe. I believe that different vendors are trying to new strategies to get into the traditional enterprise end user organizations, and they're betting a lot on people and experience facing enterprise challenges. So there are different kind of strategies, right? One is hiring key peoples that have experience, and another is betting on technologies that can bridge the gap between what enterprises can do today in terms of maturity and what OpenStack is supposed to give them from a technology standpoint.
So the question that we posed to this group of distinguished analysts was, why is adoption not happening? If OpenStack's so great, if all these key executives and open source leaders are joining companies like Google and Amazon, why are we not seeing more OpenStack adoption? So, Alessandro?
Because there is a massive gap between what is the expectation about what OpenStack can do and what it actually does. Okay? And there is a lot of misperception about this, not mis-expectation. In my past career, right, I had a lot of conversation with clients that now I serve with Red Hat. And a lot of those conversations were about, okay, is OpenStack a cheap version of a virtualization layer that I can get from a mainstream vendor, for example? Okay, that was top question. And that question has a behind-the-scene assumption, which is that OpenStack can run equally well what we call scale-up traditional workloads, as well as new generation, next generation scale-out kind of workloads. And that's simply not true, right? And so a lot of customers, a lot of large enterprises come to the table for discussion with this wrong expectation, and you need to do a lot of work in terms of clarifying what the different technologies can do. And once you do that, they look at you like, oh, okay, this is not exactly what I expected, or I'm not ready to go to that shift to scale out applications. And so I will come back. I will come back in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, which is the wrong way to approach it. And this is something that has a lot to do with the way vendors, all of us, okay, pitch what OpenStack can do. There is a way to have a benefit in OpenStack today for large enterprises without scare them away, without saying, this is the new world, you need to give up completely the old world, the traditional world, traditional applications to get into the new world. This is not true. But it's much more a phased approach where you consume in a gradual way the new technology, and you start to change, to evolve portions of your application into the new world. So you transition from the scale-out model to the scale-up model to the scale-out model, and you benefit at the same time. This is the key. So it's not a binary decision. At the same time, concurrently, you leverage and consume the traditional server virtualization technologies and the new infrastructure as a service technologies that OpenStack represent. Now, the key for that, anyway, is that, first of all, you realize that your application architecture, the traditional 3-tier application architecture, needs to change 1 tier at a time. So you start with the web front end, then you move to the middleware, and then potentially over time, you move to the backend database, rather than say, okay, I take the traditional 3-tier application, I throw it away, I rewrite it completely for OpenStack. That will never work for a large enterprise. It's just scary. And from a financial standpoint, it just doesn't make sense. Now, this is the first step. And the second step, sorry if this is long, you need to have a management layer on top of everything that glues together those two words, the old world and the new world. Because at the end of the day, if you have a piece of the application that stays on the scale-up model and another piece that transitions to the new OpenStack scale-out model, you need to have something on top that keeps these pieces together as a logical unit. The application needs to remain the same. You need to have the policies, the automation that remains consistent for all these pieces, right? And we never told the story in this way. We never did that, or at least not to my knowledge, and I heard a lot of vendors when I was on the other side of the table, right? We never said in this way. And so vendors are incredibly, end-user organizations are incredibly confused on how to transition this new world, and we need to change this in terms of communication.
So it seems like, from your perspective, there's a lot of work that has to happen in order for the kinds of workloads that you might run in OpenStack to be moved, and people don't understand that. And
so there are two approaches, right, to the new world of OpenStack, but in general, new technology. The first one, and I believe we try for a little bit to advise in that direction, was to say, okay, so you keep your traditional workloads on your server virtualization environment, the scale-up environment, you focus just on the new projects, okay, the greenfield application for the new OpenStack infrastructure as a service environment. And it makes a lot of sense from on paper, right? But in practice, enterprises take a lot of time to develop this new greenfield application.
So to move the conversation along, so as enterprises are looking at these new greenfield applications, it seems like technologies like Docker and other approaches that are even more efficient are a strategy to get some of these enterprises on board. So maybe that's a good segue to talk about what Google's doing.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So I think one of the sort of promises of OpenStack was this idea of workload portability, and it hasn't lived up to that capability. And I think containers is a better way to do it. It's a lightweight, hermetically sealed environment. It's super, super fast and efficient. And I think just in the last couple of quarters, you've seen amazing response, right, to Docker and to containers. And I think that's probably a reaction against the way we've been doing things in the past. And we're partnering with a bunch of companies there. Red Hat's a key partner. IBM's on board. Microsoft is on board. VMware is now on board. So you're kind of seeing, the sort of sort of world of infrastructure of the last 10 years starting to mesh with a newer way of doing things. And they'll live side by side for a while. But yeah, we're fully on board with the container strategy.
And what are you seeing, Peter, out there in terms of adoption?
I think adoption is a problem of how easy is it to consume. Chris Lonnie was mentioned from Disney earlier on today, and at the OpenStack Summit in Atlanta, I asked him one of the questions that we ask our enterprise respondents. What was the biggest challenge you had in implementing your OpenStack implementation? In fact, with CERN and with the other panel member as well, every single person said human change management. It's not the technology, we can fix that. People are not really concerned about OpenStack being immature any more than they are about VMware or anybody else, because an awful lot of people won't be using it in anger for a couple of years. And out of the survey that we did recently, 58% of people were still at the server virtualization or automation stage of their infrastructure. Only 17% have private clouds, and they're primarily going private first, as they did with virtualization. Keep it in-house, learn how to do it before they move outwards. Now, clearly, there's stuff at Google, there's stuff at Amazon, there's stuff with Microsoft, and of course, some of those are proprietary architectures. But it's really a readiness situation, but it's moving very, very fast. If you think about server virtualization, VMware was founded in '98. It was 2003 before there was an enterprise-ready sort of solution. It's now 2014, and 32% of our respondents are still at the virtualization stage. So with OpenStack being, was it 4 years old now? It's tremendous momentum that we've got on top of that. So things are happening, but it's just going to take these organizations time to move.
So to kind of pull up for a second, it seems like if we think about OpenStack in the way we saw the computer industry evolve, we're at the Computer History Museum, and I encourage you all to walk downstairs and tour the exhibits. It's amazing if you haven't. But we've really built a new kind of computer. Whereas old computers had disks and a CPU and memory all in one box, these new computers that run these new applications are loosely coupled systems that often take the space of a warehouse. And OpenStack seems to have evolved into the leading candidate for the operating system for that computer. And I see efforts like Docker as a way, like Java, to the workstations and to the servers of old, being a platform emerging. And there will be Pivotal, there will be various platform options. But I guess the question is, have we moved past the debate over what the underlying operating system for the cloud computer is with the recent progress over the past year with OpenStack?
I would say for on-premise workloads, absolutely 100%, yeah. And my sense is as soon as there's a single semantic deployment model for OpenStack, enterprises can fully embrace it. It's been super hard for them, right? You can't take one tool today and point it at 2 different OpenStack distros. So as soon as there is a preferred deployment for it, then the floodgates will open on the enterprise on-prem side.
It's really about that ecosystem of software running on these cloud systems. And I think once that software is there, that's what people will use to then scale the investments in their new platforms.
Yeah, there's also a complexity to this, because I certainly agree about the on-prem side. And clearly, we've got great platforms like Google and Amazon and Azure that do really good technology, et cetera. They're highly secure. Maybe not the same style of security or the same tools that people want to use, but they're certainly not regarded as being insecure. But there's a whole set of stuff in the middle. An awful lot of people are not going to want to own their own data centers. They're going to go out to Digital Realty or Equinix or somewhere else. Or they're going to go to a rack space and have a private hosted cloud so they can get that internal level of security but not have the infrastructure investment. And so we've yet to see a lot of that stuff play out as the telcos and so many other kinds of vendors want to come out. But that's also part of this whole idea of having containers and other trusted technologies that allow people to choose an execution venue. And really it's going to be, do I want it to be on-prem or do I want it to be off-prem, either in private hosted or a public cloud or whatever? And how much do I want to own? How much control do I want? So all of those things are going to change the nuances. And then if you're in different countries, you've got different data sovereignty issues and things to deal with as well. And so you may have data centers in Germany, but not in France. So you might have a private on-prem in Germany, private hosted in France, and a spillover facility. And you might well be using Google as well. So it's going to get very complicated as we move forwards.
So back to Alessandro. So you've made some acquisitions at Red Hat over the past summer as well. We've seen Ceph, which was a leading open source storage technology, become part of Red Hat. Gluster before that, others. What do you see in terms of the key features you need in OpenStack to increase adoption? Is it higher level platform services, or do we still have work to do on the network layer? Where does, from your perspective at Red Hat, what's missing?
Right. So there are a number of areas where OpenStack can grow, right? Some are tactical and solve small, short-term kind of challenges, like the installer, for example, smoother installation, right? And I heard a lot of people saying, okay, that is a big pain, and there is plenty of companies that are working to make it better and better, but that is a very tactical problem to solve. You cannot just bet your entire strategy or believe that a large enterprise is going to bet on a vendor just because of the installer. Other things need to happen, right? One of those things that is more strategic level is the capability to think beyond what OpenStack is offering today. OpenStack cloud infrastructure, so is the enablement for a very complicated cloud system. But by itself is not enough. You need to couple that with a bunch of layers that can be part of the OpenStack project, can come from other projects, but merge together in a seamless way, right? That integrate together in a seamless way to enforce security policy and configuration compliance and all the other things that a large enterprise needs. So at the moment we're focusing on OpenStack, and this may be on purpose, or it may be just because we need to reach a higher level of maturity as a community. We're looking just in a very tactical way what OpenStack can do, and we look at the infrastructure side of things and we say, okay, we want to make it the best possible infrastructure. And we are adding specific portions in networking, as you said, in storage, the installer and so on. But then you need to think long term. You need to think, okay, these customers, these large enterprises that run very complicated issues, and need to, for example, integrate with a bunch of different hardware that comes from 20 years of legacy IT. And they have the enterprise security system and the help desk and remediation system. How they can possibly manage the life cycle of the applications inside OpenStack. We're not yet thinking in that term, right? So we're still looking at the house, to use an analogy, and still looking at improving the foundation. But that's not even the beginning of what we should think about.
So if, the last 3 minutes here, if I pull up and I'm Jeff Bezos, or if I'm Larry Page, and I have seen our data centers, and I see millions of servers, and I see what we pay to build and operate these facilities, I might look at this OpenStack gathering down the street at the Computer History Museum and say, those guys are going to be history, right? Because I can operate infrastructure at a fraction of the cost of any enterprise. Even hiring one employee will make whatever an enterprise does with their infrastructure so much more expensive.
Right.
So with that perspective, but today trillions of dollars are spent on computing hardware and software and infrastructure, I guess let me just spin this back around. I'm interested in Joe's perspective on this. What's the strategy when in 10 years Google's even bigger, Amazon's even bigger, Microsoft's even bigger, and you've got so much of the software running in the cloud proper? What sits in the enterprise? And how does OpenStack fit into that?
It's a migration for these enterprise guys, right? You can't just say to, people are not going to, nobody makes huge leaps, right, with all the investment in technology and skills, et cetera, that they have today. You don't just dump all of that, right, and leap to this newer world. So it's a gradual migration, and every enterprise is on the different, path there in terms of how far along towards public cloud they are. But I think you kind of nailed it, that long term, why do you want to, it's not the core business of, automotive companies or pharmaceutical companies or name every other vertical out there, right? They're not in the infrastructure business, so why do you want to be building cloud platforms? So,
customer perspective on that, Peter?
At the moment, I think our last survey, about 56% of people felt that they could deliver internal cloud services at either the same cost or lower cost than going out to, say, to an Amazon, which is one of the best known ones. Now, there's a lot of costs other than just the data center efficiency and the sort of price you would pay per CPU or per storage. There's an awful lot of management, business risk, development costs and things internally. So it's very complex for enterprises. Certainly, there are a lot of things that are going to move out into the public cloud avenues. And the data centers that a Google or an Amazon or an eBay or anybody else has are phenomenally good and efficient, but there's an awful lot of internal business costs that mitigate some of that. And so I think it is going to be a slow journey, because at the end of the day, it's about trust, and it's about making sure that you can trust your operations as you would do if you own them yourself. And at the moment, people so far inside most large enterprises aren't quite ready to go there yet for, say, an Amazon or somebody else. They're getting there for some of their workloads, but it's going to take time.
Excellent. So I guess in summary, it sounds like OpenStack has achieved enough momentum at this point to be the foundation for infrastructure, but adoption will require a lot of change and a lot of work within the enterprise, and there'll be a whole new generation of platforms that emerge to try to take advantage of this new interoperable standard way of running infrastructure. And I think Google and Amazon and Microsoft all will use OpenStack as perhaps a bridge to the future as we migrate a lot of infrastructure in today's enterprise data centers into the cloud. Fair?
Sounds like a plan.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and to our panelists, Peter, Joe, and Alessandro. All right, it's the home stretch. If your brain's not full yet, it will be now. Our last panel is anchored by Jonathan Bryce, Executive Director of the OpenStack Foundation, features Jonathan Donaldson of Intel, my old friend Brian Gentile of TIBCO and Jaspersoft, and Nati Shalom of Gigaspaces. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. It's Mirantis' viral marketing strategy. T-shirts everywhere, yes. So I just want to take a minute and ask you guys to introduce yourselves. This panel, we're going to talk about open source business models, kind of the money side of open source, not just specific to OpenStack. But our panel here has a lot of experience with a variety of different technologies, and so I just wanted to give each of you just a minute to explain who you are and kind of your background with open source from a business perspective. So Nati, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so first of all, my name is Nati Shalom, the CTO and founder of Gigaspaces, and we've been running initially a closed source product named XAP today, and we forked a new product that is completely open source. So we've gone through the experience of actually moving not a very big company from a proprietary non-open source enterprise kind of product to a completely open source product. So I think we have the spectrum of how you do that also within a small company and how you do a transition while you keep the business going.
Sure, okay, thank you. Brian.
I'm Brian Gentile. I'm the Senior Vice President and General Manager of TIBCO Analytics, but through a recent acquisition by TIBCO of Jaspersoft. I've spent about 17 years in open source, including my days at Sun in the late 90s, where we began the whole Java movement. And then, of course, Jaspersoft, 7 years as CEO from 2007 until the acquisition just 3-4 months ago.
And Jonathan?
Jonathan Donaldson, General Manager for Software-Defined Infrastructure at Intel. Personally, I've had a transition through lots of proprietary vendors, Cisco, EMC, VMware, via VCE, lots of different places. Now at Intel, Intel has a long-standing history of both open source contribution. We're typically the number 1, number 2 kernel developer for Linux. We also do Chrome and lots of other things, Android, as well as helping our proprietary vendor partners with some of their code. So we kind of straddle the fence, if you will, on both sides of the open source and the proprietary side of the things.
So let's start there. So from your perspective, what is the business case for Intel to have that kind of involvement in these various open source projects?
Sure. Well, so anybody who's been in a data center lately knows that there's a tremendous amount of Intel in most data centers out there. And so really our sole goal in that space is to make sure that when customers purchase Intel CPUs and other Intel parts that go into their servers, that they get the maximum value out of that purchase. So we do a lot of enablement in the open source community to make sure that the intellectual property features that we have in the silicon actually gets exposed and usable by them so that they get what they pay for.
Okay. So, one of the things that we've heard several times today, and that we've seen at most OpenStack events is just kind of the incredible growth of the OpenStack ecosystem. Not just OpenStack specifically, but what are the drivers that take an open source project beyond just something that's a one company project or a two company project to something that a lot of people participate in? Brian, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I've always said that an open source project has to solve a real business problem. It can't just be partial solution. It needs to really satisfy some major unmet need. An OpenStack hits that in spades, right? And then beyond that, it needs to have the ability for a variety of methods of contribution. And the truth is, even in the most vibrant open source community, there's a relatively few number who can actually create, contribute, and commit code. That precious number is vital to the vibrancy of that community, but there should be many other ways to contribute, including technical Q&A forum participation, help with identifying and maybe fixing bugs if possible, localizing. There are a lot of other aspects to participation in an open source community that lends itself directly to vibrancy beyond just contributing and committing code, although that nucleus is hugely valuable.
Actually, there is a... Oh, sorry. Yeah. I think that there are different reasons why open source projects succeed and fail. And in each project, you would see actually different reasons for that. So let's take NoSQL as an example. The reasons why they succeeded is that they entered a very proprietary space, a very expensive space, and that was a commodity strategy. So by coming with an open source project that is disruptive, that is obviously much cheaper than a lot of the solution that exists there, there was enough incentive and demand to jump on that, and that kind of ride that wave. And by the way, that principle applied to only a certain group of companies, not to all companies. So not all companies that open source their product after, for example, MongoDB and Cassandra were as successful as those companies. The second example is Docker. And Docker, I think, is a very interesting example because I think that that's an open source project that went from disruption to commodity in a period of 6 months or less. And that's an interesting view of the speed of evolution of technology. And the reasons why is because they were entering a very small space that wasn't touching the foot of anyone in the industry and still solving a problem. But because it was tiny enough and wasn't disruptive, it actually got the adoption. So that was a very different, I think, reasons why that project picked up much faster. I think in the OpenStack case, we got to the point where in the case of Rackspace, they were competing with Amazon, and obviously a lot of companies like Rackspace realized that they can't really compete alone. And so the motivation was to create a coalition, and open source becomes a mean to an end. In that case, how you build a coalition, you form an open source project and you build a coalition, which is a completely different thing than what you would see with Docker and what you would see with Mongo or what you would see with other things. So I think those are the kind of spectrum of reasons why open source projects succeed. It's either because there is a demand for a coalition, standardization, or there is a highly proprietary, very expensive market and you want to disrupt it, or there is a space that is small enough that everyone want to jump on it. I think those are the 3 examples that I had in mind.
Yeah, let me take a slightly different editorial spin on that. A colleague of mine who's also an operator of OpenStack recently said, common problems breed community. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing in this massive adoption of OpenStack, the massive community. But the greatest fear there is kind of like the Viking ship, right? If we're all rowing together, we can get really good acceleration. But if we're all doing it from our own kind of party line or vendor line and we're out of sync, right, then we just either go in circles and thrash the water quite a bit.
Yeah.
So we really need to make sure that the mass adoption from a community perspective also comes with the acceleration.
There are a lot of OpenStack analogies that I've heard, but I think that's the first time I've heard Viking ship. So.
As long as it's not the flaming one.
Yeah, I have to add that to the lexicon. So, I mean, you both talked about sort of why a community might form, why a project might gain traction, but on the business model side specifically, we've seen a lot of interesting both startups and established businesses get involved into in participating in OpenStack. What do you think is the draw for them, and what do you think are the outlets for for actually building a profitable and successful business model on something like OpenStack or some of the other examples that Nadi gave. I mean, if you look to some of those examples, some of them are they have a main corporate backer. Some of them don't. What drives that delineation between them?
So things like OpenStack, right, allow them entry into spaces that they wouldn't have been able to get into before, right? So either they didn't have an offering in that space, or this strengthens their offering, or they're looking for an additional way to get into a larger market share, a bigger addressable market. From a value perspective, like, when would they go build a business model around it, right? So if they're looking at, say, enterprise customers in a lot of cases really do like that licensed model, the support model, I know that you've spent time doing regression testing, you have an HCL, you have indemnity, and I can choke you, single throat to choke if I run into a problem. The for-fee business model also enables you, there's lots of great articles on this in the past about how on the top of open source, you can actually innovate, you can get your payback for delivering that, you can build a business, and then as that becomes more and more common, that starts to filter down into the open source project, and you can continue to innovate on top of that while still actually having a business model as part of that. And I think that's a pretty good business model.
Yeah, and so
Go ahead, Nadi.
I think that we tend to look at that as a kind of romantic decision that, at some point, some corporate guy thought that open source is a great thing, and then the entire ship of that big company went into open source because it's the great thing in the world, and we want to contribute to the world. The reality is very different. In many cases, they're forced to that decision. In many cases, if they could succeed without going to OpenStack or to open source, they would. Like in the case of Amazon, like in the case of Microsoft. They didn't take that strategy, and they're very, very successful, like in the case of Google to a certain degree. So in many cases, it was a lack of another choice, of alternative. And a lot of people, I think, in the community, and that's a valid strategy, is that you go into a coalition when you can't do something on your own. And that's a valid reason, and I think most of the people that drive the community comes from that state of mind that there is no other option. There is no other option.
Has open source created an environment in technology where there is no kind of long-term differentiator in technology that you can carve out and hold on to for decades now?
Well, I think quite the opposite, actually. I was going to answer your former question, by the way, with the idea of head, heart, and groin. Head, heart, and groin, right? Which we used to talk about in the early days of open source. We talked about it as the whole person is fully engaged. There's a business reason. There's a change my world part of the decision, which means that my life will get better if I'm able to take this open source project and turn it into something that's even more valuable to solve my problem. That's sort of the heart. And then the groin is like, well, I want to be part of this community because it's thriving and it's growing and it's changing the world.
I think I'm going to move over here a little bit further.
Yeah. No, I mean, but it's like the whole psyche's involved. But I think that the development and distribution methodology that is open source has already proven to be the most valuable that the world has yet known for software construction. You can liken it to the methods in other hard sciences for sharing breakthroughs. And in this regard, you could say that computer science is a laggard in its use of open source, right? If all the world's physicists held tight to their breakthroughs, where would we be today in the understanding of the physical science? And so computer science, a bit of a laggard, but coming on strong with the notion of shareable and participative development around some common problem. And in this regard, I think development and distribution of projects that solve real problems and can do so in unique ways is actually superior in an open source development and distribution model, not hampered by it if done correctly.
So my only rebuttal to that is, and we do both open source and proprietary, is that somebody has to pay the bills, right? So there's typically a funding company for your developers that are writing code into the open source community, so you have to keep that in the back of your mind too. So the trick there is how do I get the business model such that it doesn't impede the innovation, right? And you had actually asked the question is, does open source stop you from carving out, let's say, a niche that you can hold for 10 years? And I would say probably in most cases.
On the software level is
on
where
the
I'm
software
talking.
level. Yeah, and
I mean,
I
that's
agree.
like for you, that's your business. You're contributing to open source to drive a different business than software licensing, you know?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So, but in the software business, I think it's going to be harder and harder and harder to carve out a big chunk of anything that you can hold on to for a long time. I think the open source aspect keeps driving the innovation faster and faster at a faster and faster pace, because instead of having proprietary version where you have, if you're lucky, 100 developers, 150, 200 developers focused on it, have thousands of developers trying to solve some of the same problems, and you get a lot of acceleration as long as they're pointing in the same direction.
Yeah.
And I think in that regard, what open source does is, in terms of commoditization, it actually moved the needle of where the value is, or where the value starts. So it used to be a point in which you would pay for something, even though it was shelfware, as they were called. And obviously that didn't produce value, but you were forced to pay for it in a way. And open source kind of changed the dynamics in that regard, that you pay only for things that are valuable, and things that are not valuable or commodity should be commodity, and that becomes open source. So I think it forced the industry to actually generate more value, and I think from that regard it did a very good thing for a lot of software companies, because it forced them to look at what they're actually doing and what they're actually producing, and what are the actual problems that they're solving, and force them to look into the areas in which they add value and contribute to areas in which it doesn't make a difference.
So one thing that I would love to get your take on, you hear a lot of commentary about how many companies are involved in OpenStack. And it is a very large number. And so two parts to the question. One, do you think that that's a liability or benefit? And the second part is, with these alternative business models, besides just software licensing, sales and support, driving other product sales, turning it into public cloud services, that kind of thing, are we looking at a market over the next 10 or 20 years that will continue to support this size of an ecosystem?
So my point of view is that if we look at Android as an example, the current state of OpenStack, where there is a lot of participants in the ecosystem, where all claim equal share, quote unquote, like in any democracy, is not a healthy situation, because it could lead to stagnation, and it could lead to a lack of execution at some point, and things on that line. I don't think that any democracy could operate well when all parties are equal. It needs to have some center of gravity that leads that, and then the rest helps that to counterbalance that center of gravity. That's the point that I think happens in Android, for example, where Google creates that center of gravity, and then there is a whole ecosystem, very healthy ecosystem in my view, that drives that, and there is a fairly large ecosystem around that. So I think from a maturity perspective, we need to get to the point that the ecosystem is not equal, and everyone accept that, and there is a certain leadership in that ecosystem that drives that, and the ecosystem counterbalance that leadership, and only that will be healthy. So right now, in my view, where there is too many people who or companies that will argue for that equal right, is not healthy. That's my view, and that's not sustainable in my view again.
I would agree. I think that there are a variety of different ultimate ecosystem organizational structures that can form around major open source projects. Each one takes on a little bit different flavor. The early days of Java were very different than the late days of Java, and very different from where it is today. But the Linux Foundation is another good example. And I think it's a living, breathing thing. And the hierarchy, those who can help lead and shepherd it, have the responsibility to constantly keep in touch with the best structure that should emerge for the advancement of, in this case, the OpenStack Foundation.
Yeah, no, I agree with those things. I think that the way the foundation and the technical committee has set things up is actually delivering a lot of good solutions to those problems, and that you do have a lot of vendors out there that are kind of trying to get their hook right for their product line into this. But I think through the kind of the meritocracy that we see as far as code submissions, we're starting to get the right behavior, and that if you're doing a good common level of code, it kind of the tide raises all ships. Right, so then when you actually do go and you've got some karma built up and you can get your code for your vendor's portion of that in there, then you have a bigger market share to go penetrate, as well as you're going to get accepted for those much cleaner. So I think that's the right thing.
Okay. Well, thank you guys very much for being on this panel, Nati, Brian, Jonathan, and I think that is the last panel now. And good news is we all get to go eat lunch. So thank you all for joining.
Thank you very much. Everybody start clapping before you leave. Nah, clap harder. Come on, these guys have been talking all morning.